back in retrospect, there wasn't one to be done with Saido, yet we still pressed the issue and made maybe as many as 4 bids for him. And I just have never really quite understood that. I mean, maybe the American way of doing business is so direct, you pick up the phone and say, I want this, will you deal? And as you pointed out, that's not the case. But I just don't understand. I'm curious to get your thoughts there.
Yeah, well, like you said, it's not the case in the transfer market. There's not necessarily a straight phone call unless that particular relationship is there between the two chairmen where that can actually happen, which is quite rare. It's obviously there's a lot of talking that goes on for people acting on behalf of the club, where basically over a course of a period you get the sense of whether you're in a position to actually pick up the phone or not. So obviously Tottenham, in regards to Timo Werner, realised at a certain point that they were not in a position to do that. But this should tell you something about the Saido Berahino deal, that actually it got to a certain point where Tottenham realised they were in a position to pick up the phone and have a conversation with West Brom about buying Berahino. So, as far as Jeremy Peace saying outright that he's not for sale, well, I mean, from my point of view, he contradicted himself, because he said that Berahino was not for sale, but he also said in the same statement that Tottenham's valuation of the player didn't meet their valuation of the player, and if there is a valuation of the player, then the opportunity is there for him to be sold. And the way I understand it is the opportunity was there for him to be sold, despite Peace's comments in public. And I think, judging by Berahino's reaction, he also thought that there was a possibility that he could be sold too. So that should say something else about that particular transfer.
Yeah, it's an awfully high valuation. I mean, when Pedro goes from Barcelona to Chelsea for 21 and they want 25 for Berahino, that just makes no sense financially at all.
Well, I mean, I think there's a confusion with the valuations of players. I think a lot. At least I see a lot of people valuing players purely on their ability on the pitch, and purely their potential also in the future to perform on the pitch. I mean, like you say, if you look at it at face value, if you look at it almost superficially, and you compare Pedro to Berahino, you'd say, well, there's only one player that wins outright there. There's only one player that should be worth more than the other, but there's a lot more that goes into it than that. I mean, obviously, clubs trading players domestically, so clubs trading players within England automatically raises the price of a player because of the particular market. Also, Saido is an English player as well. He's an England under 21. He's a commodity in that sense. If you look at young English strikers and who the next wave of young English strikers are to come through, well, number one on your list is probably going to be Harry Kane. He's already come through in many senses. The next one down your list is Danny Ings, who Tottenham obviously tried to sign and were unsuccessful. And then the next one down your list is Saido Berahino. So that's one of the reasons why he was valued as highly as he was, is because that Tottenham were very obviously targeting young English strikers and looking to build a team in that way. And young English strikers like Berahino were a commodity, so they're going to cost more than other strikers from Europe. That's the way that the market works.
Understood.
Yeah. So to kind of wrap up how the window closed for us, that left us with arguably just Harry Kane as our one striker, because Adebayor's been frozen out. He couldn't get his move. Now, there's been some humming and ahhing about Son and where his role will be. He's listed as an attacker, he's listed as a midfielder, and then obviously we know G is an attacking midfielder. How do you think Poch is going to manage the attacking options for the club to protect Harry to some degree, and God forbid what happens if he gets an injury?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a confusion really between. I mean, we're really going to get into start getting into how you define what a striker is, and how you define what a forward is, and how you define what Harry Kane is, and how you define what Heung-min Son is. I mean, in England especially, we have a tendency to view the centre forward, the Harry Kane type of centre forward, with very high regard. I mean, he's very much the Roy of the Rovers type player, the star, the pinnacle, whatever you want to call it, the spearhead of the team, the one that scores all the goals and did score all the goals last season. So they're very much heralded in that regard, and people very much look towards the centre forward to be the man to supply the goals. but I don't think Pochettino is looking at it in that way, despite Harry Kane's goals last year. I mean, I know for a fact that he wants goals from the whole team. He wants his 4 forwards, and what I mean by the 4 forwards is that the player playing off the left, the player playing off the right, the player playing through the middle behind the striker, and the striker himself, the centre forward, whatever you want to call him. He wants those 4 positions to be very versatile. He wants those 4 positions to be revolving in a way. I mean, if you watch the way that Tottenham play, Harry Kane doesn't just stay in the middle all the time. He very much pulls out left, pulls out right, pulls deep, collects the ball, and someone else will take his position. And you know, even lower down the leagues in England, and you watch the successful teams and the way that they play, that's very much how they play. Players revolve positions. They change positions. They swap positions with each other in order to confuse defenders, and that's the way that Pochettino wants to play with Tottenham. So I think in his mind, and I understand it, is that if he was to use Heung-min Son, for example, as a centre forward, or at least if he was to be positioned there as the team was lined up on Sky Sports 1 on a Sunday, and you would see him there, whether he would actually spend the whole time on the pitch there is another matter. I don't think he would. You know, he's very much somebody who would be able to drift deep, drift left, drift right, and be able to allow the space for other players to take up his position and very much confuse defenders. And for me personally, you know, if the way I look at a team, teams that do that are very, very successful. And so there really is, a choice of whether you want a centre forward who's just a centre forward, as very much Kane is viewed, even though he isn't, or do you want a player in that position who actually can do more than just that? But yeah. I think a lot of people's concerns are whether Heung-min Son or Clinton Ng can do that at all. And I mean, from what I've seen of those 2 players, which is not very much, but what I've seen from them and heard about them is that they have played through the middle. They do have the capacity to play through the middle, and with some tactical training and coaching from Pochettino, which he is very good at, I think that both of them would be at least an asset through the middle, if not dangerous through the middle at the very most, at least until January anyway.
Yeah, and I think a lot of Spurs fans, they like to label players, so that's probably where that fear comes from. You know, obviously Bale fulfilled a multiple of positions.
Yeah, he's a great example.
In his last season.
Great example.
And I know that was under, obviously, AVB, but I think Poch's style is very similar in a lot of regards. And I think that the modern approach is to be able to utilise players in different roles, particularly in the attacking third. And, hopefully it pans out, because we don't have a lot of options until January if it doesn't. So let's hope you're right. All right, so just to wrap up the recent transfer window, who do you felt was the club that did the best job with their transfer window business? I mean, you can obviously speculate those with the money did the best job, but I don't think it's just a straightforward as that. But who do you think did the best ins and outs and got the team that they really wanted to set themselves up for the season?
Well, I think that in this transfer window particularly, and this is one of the reasons why it's been quite difficult actually, I think, for journalists to be able to report on accurately, is we've seen a change in the transfer window, and it's very much to do with the amount of TV money that's gone into the league, and also the amount of TV money that's set to come into the league next year and the next few years after that. And there's the clubs that have been squeezed in the middle, so the clubs that have found it very, very difficult to keep hold of their best players, and have also found it difficult to replace them with players of similar or equal quality, are actually in a position now where financially they don't need to cash in on their biggest players anymore, and that's why we've seen West Brom be able to take such a strong stance with Berahino. And one of the reasons why I've argued that actually you can't necessarily blame Levy for what happened with Berahino, and it's very easy to blame Levy based on previous transfer windows, but actually the transfer window has changed, so this is a different instance. This is actually we're seeing it throughout the league, not just with Berahino. You saw it with Everton keeping hold of John Stones, for example, as well. So I think the clubs that have done the best transfer window, to actually answer your question directly, is the clubs in the middle. The clubs further down the leagues. Clubs like Leicester, for example, have done a fantastic job.
Swansea,
another team that do very, very well with their recruitment methods. But actually, what's been happening is that you have 4 clubs in England, or 5 clubs actually, if you count Liverpool, who have the financial muscle to be able to compete in the top bracket in the transfer market. And by the top bracket, I mean the real best players, in Europe, or the best players in the world even. They have at least the capacity to be able to compete for them. I don't necessarily mean the ability to sign the players, but at least the capacity to compete, the capacity to actually have the conversation and to have a chance. Even Liverpool, who didn't finish in the top 5 last year, have the chance, and they bought some of those players. I mean, Roberto Firmino, for example, is a player that a lot of big clubs have looked at, a lot of big clubs have been interested in, and they've managed to bring him in themselves. So what's happened is that over the last probably 2, 3, maybe 4 years, you've had these clubs dominating the transfer market and signing the best players, and the other clubs have realised that they can't compete with these clubs, and they have to find another way of doing things. They have to find another way of recruiting players, another way of scouting players, and thinking about other things when they recruit players that the top clubs don't think about. So if you look at Southampton, for example, who are a perfect example of that, and Tottenham in many ways are looking to follow that model. It's one of the reasons why they brought in Pochettino and why they brought in Paul Mitchell, is they're looking to recruit in a different way, in a clever way. And that means looking at every possible detail. That means looking at who the particular individual is as a person, what he does with his spare time, what his hobbies are, what his interests are, where he went to school, what his subjects were at school that he was interested in. Absolutely everything. Their Facebook accounts, how they talk to their friends, all that kind of stuff it goes into it. And that's because, especially where Tottenham are concerned, is they don't want another set of players that are bad eggs, for want of a better term, if you see what I mean. They don't want players who have bags of quality, that are no doubtly great players, but they don't have the character, they don't have the personality to cope with certain moments of emotional strife, shall we say.
Yeah.
Because if you look at the players that they brought in 2013, there's several players that haven't been able to cope with it emotionally. I mean, there's no doubt that Paulinho is a good player. I mean, he's a good player in terms of his quality, in terms of his technical ability, in terms of his tactical knowledge. He's a good player, and there's no denying he's a good player. But he doesn't have the character. He didn't have the backbone to be able to adapt to a different country. He didn't have the backbone to be able to adjust to life in England. He didn't have the backbone to be able to adjust to adversity of being moaned at by his own supporters on a Saturday. He didn't have the capacity to be able to deal with the criticism that he was getting in the press, and he didn't have the capacity to be able to deal with what was going on around him, and so he therefore couldn't perform on the pitch. You know, people have to remember that these guys are human beings at the end of the day, and they're not robots. They might be quality players in one country, but if emotionally they can't cope with where they are, then that quality won't shine through. And it's another thing we've seen with Eric Lamela as well, is that, as far as I understand it, Eric Lamela's tried excessively hard to adjust to England. He's tried excessively hard to learn English, and you know, I don't just speak to one person. All the people that I've spoken to, either inside Tottenham or outside Tottenham, who know him, have told me that he's been trying so hard to learn the language and really working as hard as he possibly can, but even for him it's not working out. So
yeah, well, I don't know whether you saw this or not, and I'm not even sure whether you're familiar with a podcast called Men in Blazers. It's Raj Bennett and Davies is the other guy, and they're very prominent on NBC here, and they have a big podcast. And Raj did a documentary, if you will, on Southampton, and really focusing on its recent history. A lot of time was spent on the black box, and what's the general manager's name? Les, and I can't think of his.
Les Reed.
Yeah, Les Reed. And Les spoke specifically about what you were just referring to, about really understanding, the true background and backbone of these players. He talked a lot about James Ward-Prowse, talked a lot about Gareth Bale, starting at 8 years old, talking about, talking with junior coaches, etc. So, good transition for, Mitchell and the Black Box. Have you been able to interview him? Do you know much about his staff, their process, their approach to things? I'd be curious to see if you can share any information there.
Well, they're very much about what I just talked about. They're very much about absolutely every single detail they can possibly cover. These guys are very, very experienced guys. Paul Mitchell started MK Dons, did very well at MK Dons, and obviously pioneered this black box that seems to become a very mysterious, enigmatic thing at Southampton that people are very interested in. And
surely that had to get rebuilt here, right? Because it's not like he walked out of Southampton's offices with that tucked under his arm, eh? Did he have to rebuild that from scratch here at Spurs?
I don't.